Louisville Cardinals are still in control of their own destiny. We'll explain on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, what is going on, everyone? Welcome into this Monday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I want to take this time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to get started. The loss to Notre Dame was a tough one, to say the least. But Louisville, now 3-1, is still in control of their own destiny moving forward. The Cardinals are in a really good spot to contend for yet another ACC championship berth. We'll discuss the pathway to Charlotte, the obstacles that are in the Cardinals' way, and much more, while also diving into a Monday mailbag segment at the conclusion of this Monday edition of the show. We've had a couple of days to get a grasp on what happened on Saturday. Louisville just frankly didn't play well enough across all fronts, made too many mistakes, especially in that first quarter. It was catastrophic. And the reality is that to beat a good Notre Dame team on the road, you had to put together a good performance. And Louisville just didn't do that. And they had their opportunities at the end, had the ball around midfield with a chance to go down and tie it in the fourth quarter. They weren't able to do so. Offensively, couldn't really get a rhythm going. Defensively, broken plays hurt the Cardinals, and then special teams mishaps and much more. So all across the board, just not a good performance. And this was a tough one. Like I said, I woke up Sunday morning feeling like Louisville was still the better team, in my opinion. I didn't feel like the performance was an indication of how good the team was. Now, look, both teams made their mistakes. Notre Dame had their fair share of mishaps that they allowed Louisville to capitalize on, and Louisville benefited from that. But it felt like Notre Dame started to clean things up at the end of the second quarter, and they played a relatively clean second half. Louisville just continually kept making the mistakes that were creating these self-inflicted wounds that prevented them from being able to come back. Now, I'm not naive enough to suggest that both teams didn't help the others out. But it's sort of like last season when Louisville beat Notre Dame. I had a bunch of Fighting Irish fans, friends of mine, and people that I'm not really friends with, but had commented on some posts saying that they still believe that Notre Dame was the better team. And I respected it. But like what they said last year and what I'm saying this year, it doesn't matter who the better team you believe is, because the reality is that Notre Dame won the game. They made the winning plays when they needed to. They overcame their mistakes better than Louisville did. Frankly, they deserved to win, and they did. Credit to Notre Dame, credit to Marcus Freeman, Riley Leonard, and a really good Notre Dame defense. People keep bringing up Northern Illinois. Truthfully, I think that was a fluke game. I really do think that this Notre Dame team is a good team. Great running game, great defense. So ultimately, it is what it is. That's all I'm going to say about that matchup is regardless of who I feel like is better, it's not going to say Louisville 3-1. There's an asterisk by the record saying should have won that game. No. You either win or you lose. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. Now, Louisville has to bounce back. They're being tasked with moving on. It was not an easy loss to endure. You have to move on. There were some promising things to take away from the performance, but it was clear that some pretty significant improvements were needed to be made. I am confident in the coaching staff and the players on this team to be able to make those adjustments and be better moving forward. Because truthfully, the Cardinals are still in control of their own destiny. They have a lot to play for. One loss does not define the season. Just like when Louisville lost to Pittsburgh last year, it doesn't define the season. And truthfully, you could say, well, I mean, it really shouldn't surprise anyone. That loss to Pittsburgh was much more detrimental to the Cardinals than this Notre Dame loss. Number one, it was a conference loss. And number two, Pittsburgh was really bad. This Notre Dame team was pretty good. They're a ranked team. So, again, no ill will toward Notre Dame fans. Wish you all the best of luck moving forward, but it's time to turn the page. We now look ahead. Cardinals have 8 games remaining on their schedule. I will reiterate, their destiny is in their hands. If you control what you can control, you will be back in Charlotte, because the loss to Notre Dame does not count as a conference loss. So basically, all it does is hurt the national perception. And truthfully, I feel like Louisville's best avenue to get to the inaugural 12-team college football playoff was always winning the conference, because I mixed in the national perception talk and the fact that Louisville would have to win at least 10 games to get an at-large bid. Don't forget, there are automatic buys that get handed out to the Power 4 conference winners. And, the rest are basically at-large bids. So you're going to, look at the rankings. You're going to have SEC teams that are right there. Right now you have Alabama, Texas, Georgia, Missouri, Mississippi, LSU. That is 6 teams in the top 15. So right then, you can only have one SEC winner, and you're going to have a plethora of other capable SEC teams. ACC has some teams. Miami, Clemson, Louisville, Big Ten. Look at it. Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, USC. That's 4 teams right there. And you also can't forget Notre Dame. So I always felt like Louisville had to at least win 10 games to get to the to get to the college football playoffs as an at-large. And even then, you're still not entirely convinced that that's going to be the case, right? You felt like, okay, you're going to be in the conversation, but how much is the committee going to try to push a 9-3 SEC team to getting into the playoff over a 10-2 ACC team? Because it's going to happen. It truthfully is 100% going to happen, and it shouldn't surprise anyone when it does. So the roadmap was always winning the conference. And thankfully for Louisville, you didn't have a good performance, but it doesn't count against you in that regard. The Cardinals right now are currently in a 6-way tie for second place. And the only reason they're in second place is because Clemson has won 2 ACC games. You're in a 6-way tie. Duke, Miami, Boston College, SMU, Louisville, and Virginia. So you're in a really good spot because you're still at the top of the conference, a third of the way through the season, and you haven't lost a game in conference play. You, granted, have only played one, Georgia Tech. But if you remember going back to like the season preview series, sort of breaking down the schedule, I mentioned that Louisville couldn't go any worse than 3-1 to start the season. And here they are. They lost to Notre Dame. Like, nothing that has happened has really been too surprising. Like, they've handled business against the 3 teams that they were supposed to beat. And then you lost to Notre Dame. So it's almost like no harm, no foul, even though it's not really like the greatest outcome. Like, you don't want to lose, even though it might be somewhat expected from a national perspective. It does hurt Louisville's chances from a playoff berth outright. So it almost makes it to where Louisville's either going to have to run the table or they're going to have to really succeed in ACC play to not, to get in with an outright bid and not have to focus on winning the conference as a whole. So the roadmap for doing that, it will differ depending on who you ask. Because some believe, well, you're going to have to go undefeated in conference play. I don't necessarily think that it has to be that extreme, but you definitely can't lose more than 2 conference games. And even then, you still might be on the outside looking in, depending on what other teams do. But I do feel like the Cardinals are in a good spot. Like, some of the teams that are at the top right now won't be there here in about a month when conference play really gets down into the thick of things. and the cream will rise to the top. And I think Louisville is in that group. I still do think that Louisville is among the top 3 teams of the ACC, but it's clear that the Notre Dame loss and even parts of the Georgia Tech game have revealed that significant improvements still need to be made. Like, this team needs to get better and better. Like, is this a playoff caliber team? It can be. Is it right now? Probably not. But can it be? I do believe so. Let's take a look at the ACC conference picture, the teams that'll be the largest obstacles for the Cardinals, and much, much more. We'll do that on the next segment of Locked On Louisville. NFL fans, you can start the season with a large return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. If you go to FanDuel.com, you'll be able to see Louisville is about a touchdown favorite over SMU for Saturday's noon kickoff against the Mustangs at Cardinal Stadium. You can see the parlay legs all at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Louisville fans, I want to take this time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. As I mentioned, the whole mantra of this show is continually reiterating that Louisville is in control of its own destiny, because the Notre Dame loss does not count against your conference record, and whoever wins the ACC gets an automatic bye in the college football playoff. What better way to announce your presence to the national stage than handling business in conference play? And like I mentioned, Louisville is currently tied for second, a 6-way tie with 5 other teams: Duke, Miami, Boston College, SMU, Virginia. The only thing separating them from Clemson is just Clemson's 2-0. The others are 1-0. You have Stanford and Syracuse at 1-1. GT is at 1-2. You've also got Florida State, who's 1-3. Pittsburgh hasn't played a conference game yet. Cal, NC State, UNC, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, all 0-1. So right now, everything is kind of jumbled up, right? Like, there are some teams at the bottom that might be at the top and vice versa. But one thing that I feel confident in saying is that I do believe that Louisville is one of the 3 best teams in the ACC. I think that we've seen enough from the other teams across the conference to say that if they're not top 3, they're very, very close. But I don't know of any other team outside of Miami and Clemson that would really contend with Louisville, outside of maybe Boston College, a team that would maybe not necessarily Boston College, but if a team on Louisville's schedule beats them, maybe they can contend. Other teams have it tougher than others across the board. Ultimately, I look at this and I'm thinking to myself, Louisville can't lose more than 2 conference games. Honestly, they might only be able to lose 1, because I look at the other teams, and I'm really mainly looking at Miami and Clemson, because the blueprint for the Cardinals getting back to Charlotte is this: beat the teams you're supposed to beat and split the Miami and Clemson games. That's the recipe for success here, because 1 loss would guarantee that you have the head-to-head over the one team that you would be in contention with. And if you beat all the other teams, then right there you're handing them losses as well. You look at Miami's schedule. They've got at Cal this week. That would be incredible if the Golden Bears could pull off the upset. But then again, that would also put Cal in a really good spot to also be able to compete in the ACC, because outside of Miami, they don't play Clemson. They do play other ACC teams, but they lost to Florida State. Again, there's benefits and drawbacks to every situation. But you look at the Miami schedule, right? You see Cal, you've got Louisville. After that, It's Florida State, Duke, both teams I don't feel like are the greatest. At Georgia Tech, which will be the wild card. And then you have Wake Forest and Syracuse. Like, there's a legit chance that if Miami beats Cal and Louisville, they might end up 12-0. And at that point, obviously, 2 conference losses, it doesn't matter because Miami's not going to have a single loss. So then you turn to Clemson. And Clemson's got the 1 loss. It's early on in the season, albeit, but it was an SEC loss, so not really pertaining to conference play. Clemson blew out NC State. They blew out Stanford. In the rest of their conference slate, what hurts Louisville the most right now is that Clemson and Miami don't play each other. Louisville plays both. So the Cardinals are at a disadvantage. That's why I'm saying that you have to win almost, I hate to be this way, you have to split Miami-Clemson. Then you have to run the table up into the Kentucky game. And then at that point, that game really doesn't have any conference implications as much as fans do still want to win that game, obviously. Because Clemson has Florida State, Wake Forest, Virginia, Louisville, Virginia Tech, Pittsburgh. If they put it this way, yes, upsets can happen, but man, I look at both of Miami, like the time for Miami to lose was to Virginia Tech. And unfortunately, the Hokies weren't able to get the job done and puts things in a very tough way to look at it. Because as much as I say Louisville can't have more than 2 losses to make the ACC championship game, truthfully, they honestly can't have more than 1. Unless, obviously, the prerequisite to that conversation is Clemson and Miami running the table. Because if all 3 teams run the table, well, if Clemson and Miami go undefeated outside of the Louisville game, let's put it that way. Clemson and Miami, put the Louisville game to the side right now. Outside of that game, both teams win the games on their schedule in the ACC. Louisville beats the teams that they're supposed to beat, and they run the table outside of the Clemson and Miami games. The team that Louisville doesn't beat in this hypothetical automatically is going to the conference championship game. The team that Louisville beats, at that point, you have the head-to-head, and you're going to make it in. So that's what makes these 2 games really, really important. Now let's say that Louisville was to, I don't know, lose 2 conference games, and they, at 9-3, they were able to get into the conference championship. Well, then at that point, obviously, you're going to have to win it. I think that the bottom line is that the only way that Louisville wins, or the only way that Louisville gets into the college football playoff is this. There's 2 ways. Number 1, win out. Simple, right? Beat Clemson, beat Miami, beat Kentucky, win out. Or you do enough to get to and win the AC championship game. And the second is more likely. So as it relates to the other teams, I know we're talking pretty minimally in the grand scheme. Like, there are 3 teams that we're focusing on. That's because the other teams, like, I just do not have faith that these other teams are going to run the table. Like, I just don't. Like, you look at Duke. Duke is 5-0, but they really haven't played anybody. They've got to play SMU and Miami on the road. They have to take on NC State on the road. They've got to play Virginia Tech. Like, I think Duke is going to have their fair share of losses. They really haven't been all that impressive. Boston College is a team that really could throw a wrench in Louisville's plans. They have one ACC win against Florida State. They barely lost to Missouri. And they don't play Miami or Clemson. They've got Virginia, Virginia Tech, Louisville, Syracuse, SMU. It goes without saying that, like, the teams that are on the outside looking in that definitely could be in the mix here, like SMU, Boston College, on the outside looking in, maybe Virginia, and I guess Stanford because of standing purposes right now. That's why it's critical that Louisville wins outside of that, because not only do you stay step for step with Clemson and Miami, but you're also keeping the other teams at an arm's length distance away, to where it's like, okay, the only way you're going to catch us is if we implode and have multiple losses. So if you beat Virginia and Boston College and SMU and Pittsburgh like you're supposed to, then you're going to put yourself in a situation to where those teams can't catch you unless you lose to a non-Miami Clemson team. I hate that it's coming down to that, but that's just the reality of the situation here that we have to accept, is that you really can't lose more than one ACC game. And I mean, at some point you still do have to, regardless of who that loss is to, you have to split Miami Clemson. Like, you have to beat one of them. You do, you're going to be in a great chance to get to the ACC championship game. The only way that doesn't hold true is if Miami or Clemson just doesn't come to play one day and they lose to a team that they're not supposed to. But at this point, anything can happen. So we'll see how the parity in the ACC serves the conference as a whole. We're going to put the conference talk off to the side for the moment. We're going to dive into a weekly mailbag segment, Monday mailbag. Coming up, we'll answer some really key questions that I think our listeners are going to be intrigued by. We'll answer those questions coming up on the next segment of Locked On Louisville. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the official ticket place for sports, music, theater, comedy, etc. near you. They have a Game Time Picks section now that makes getting tickets for your favorite event even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. When I downloaded the app, I pretty much made a decision right then that I was not going to use any other ticketing place, because the Game Time app has a all-in pricing feature that you can toggle on to remove any surprise fees at checkout. You can see panoramic views from your seats, and then there's the Game Time lowest price guarantee. So what that means is that Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if you find tickets in the same section and row for less. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege, all one word, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. And into the final segment of this Monday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast, answering your questions from this week's mailbag. Some key questions that I am intrigued to answer. The first one: do you think that Louisville can win, or let me rephrase, do you think that Louisville will win the next 3 games? Because as I see it, they can either win the next 3 or lose the next 3. That's a pretty interesting statement, and I don't think that I necessarily disagree. The 22nd ranked Cardinals have matchups against SMU, Miami, and Virginia, or SMU, Virginia, and Miami in that order. 2 home games, the 1 road game at Virginia. Yeah, the ACC's got a ton of parity. Louisville just has to improve and show that they can be the team that we feel like they can be. SMU is going to be a challenging opponent, one that Louisville should beat, but still a challenging opponent. Virginia, right now, they seem to be very respectable, and Charlottesville's not really a place that Louisville has a ton of success in, and then Miami, that really doesn't need much explanation. So, in theory, when you're judging the polarizingly different outcomes, yeah, this team could win all 3. This team could lose all 3. I do think that Louisville has to beat SMU and Virginia, but they can win all 3. I do think that that's possible. Does your perception on the Miami Hurricanes change outside of the Virginia Tech game? I think meant to ask after the Virginia Tech game. I mean, it just goes to show you that they're beatable. Cam Ward is really, really good. They have a good offensive line, good skill position. Xavier Restrepo, Jacoby George. Defensively, good interior defense. Ruben Bain hasn't played yet, so that's something to focus on. They still do have Tyler Barron, Simeon Barrow and company. I know that they had some injuries in that Virginia Tech contest, so we'll see what that's going to look like. But the Louisville-Miami game is still, 3 weeks away? So I think that they're beatable. I'm glad that Louisville is able to get them at home. But when you have a quarterback as dynamic as Cam Ward, it's going to make things challenging. So I think that my take on the matter is that Miami is still going to be a really challenging game. So, yeah, Virginia Tech just reaffirmed the notion that they are human and that they can be beat, but you have to play a good game to make sure that that happens. With Colin Lacey back for the Cardinals, how do you think the play calling changes? I thought it was pretty interesting that Jeff Brom mentioned after the Notre Dame game that they didn't really call for many vertical plays because the pressure wasn't able to hold up. Or I'm sorry, the protection wasn't able to hold up. So the Cardinals' offensive line just has to be better in pass pro. And if they're able to do that, I think that Jeff Brom is going to open up the playbook more. You're going to see Colin Lacey get the ball in many different ways. I think you're going to see more wide receiver screens as he continually builds up to game speed. I do think that, Lacey had a pretty decent debut, 5 for 71. Got called for the weirdest pass interference call that I've seen. And he had a couple, at least one drop. Not a bad debut. I ultimately think he's going to have a really good rest of the season. So glad that he's back. Glad that we're able to pair him with Ja'Cory Brooks as well. So I think they're going to open up the playbook a good amount, and just a matter of offensive line protection. So Tyler Shuck made some really good throws in the game on Saturday. Is he a top 3 quarterback in the ACC? Good question. I think Cam Ward is in that conversation. Cade Klubnik at this point is trying to get back into it. At this point, I would say that Tyler Shuck is top 3. Grayson McCall really hasn't looked all that great. Kyron Drones has been hit or miss, although Drones is right there as well. I'll be honest with you guys. I just outside of that, I do think that right now Tyler Shuck is the top 3 quarterback in the ACC. So I'm going to go with that. Which football player are you most excited to watch play the last portion of the season? That's a tough question because you can go so many different ways, and picking one player is really challenging. I'm going to go Jamari Johnson. I think that Johnson needs to be factored into the offense more. He's made some key plays. You can tell that, since he got his body right, he has been fantastic. He's 3rd on the team in receiving yards. He has 7 catches for 102 yards. I do think that Louisville needs to incorporate him more into the passing game and make it a point of emphasis to, okay, you're going to get Colin Lacey his targets. You're going to get Ja'Cory Brooks his targets. You need to get Jamari Johnson some catches as well, because it's time to start molding him into one of the best tight ends in the ACC. So that is going to wrap up this this Monday mailbag, this Monday edition of the show. For the remainder of the week, we are going to preview the SMU contest. We'll probably have a little bit of basketball talk because the official schedule has been released, and much, much more. So be sure to stay tuned. That is going to wrap up this episode of the show. Everyone have a great day. Have a great start to your week. We'll see you right back here very soon. Go Cards.